Once upon a time, in a village cradled between two low mountains and a slow, silver river, there stood a stone church whose bell could be heard for miles. The bell called the wheat cutters in the summer and the midwives in the winter. It called lovers to quiet confidences and sinners to the confessional. Children learned the hours by its sound. Grandmothers said the bell was the village's memory. It remembered births and deaths, vows and betrayals. It was said that if the bell ever fell silent, something greater than weather would have come to pass. In the shadow of that bell lived Isabella. She had been born the year the river froze unusually early and the harvest still gave them enough. Her hair was the dark of the river at midnight, and her laugh was as sudden as a bird taking flight. She worked at her grandmother Maria's loom, threading patterns in linen that the villagers bought for weddings and funerals. Maria had raised Isabella when her parents died young. She taught her how to knead bread, how to mend the sleeves of a cloak, and how to listen, not just to sound but to silence. "Never let the bell's voice die inside you," Maria would say, tapping the hollow of Isabella's throat. "Keep a place where it can speak." Maria's eyes were small and fierce, and she wore a rosary like a farmer wears a ring, always simply without fuss. Yet Isabella's heart was a thing restless as wind. She loved the village, yet she longed to be known beyond its fences. When strangers passed through with painted trunks and loud laughter, she followed them to the riverbank and watched until their dust swallowed the road. Images rose in her like small flames, grand houses, melodious cities, applause, and she fed those flames with every story she could borrow. In secret, she prayed for a life that felt larger than the rhythm of bells and bread. On a chapel morning, while the mist still clung to the fields, Isabella dreamt of a garden walled in black stone, lit by lanterns that burned without smoke. In that garden a man with eyes like polished night handed her a golden rose. He smiled in a way that made her palms itch. "This is yours," he said. "Take it. Wear it. The world will bend to you." When she woke, the sunlight lay like a promise across Maria's work table. Isabella told her grandmother of the dream. Maria's lined face grew solemn. She placed the rosary in Isabella's hand. "Roses bloom and fade," she said, "and some thorns hide themselves inside you. If you go, take our prayers with you." Not long after, a troupe of performers came to the village. Musicians with stools stained by distant roads and a man with a silver tongue who called himself Lucian. He sold wonder and light, shimmering fabrics, songs of seaports, tales of courts where laughter could be purchased. He noticed Isabella the day she stood at the edge of the crowd and sang to a shepherd boy who had dropped his flute. "You have the look of a woman who is tired of small things," Lucian said after his voice had bent the song into gold and given it back to the children. Isabella laughed, a little sharp. "We are all small things here. You could be big," he said. He spoke of cities that never slept, of salons where names glowed on marble, of freedom from mornings and chores. His words rolled like a tide. That evening he gave Isabella a ribbon the color of dusk, and it smelled faintly of violets that did not grow in their valley. He promised a letter of invitation to a festival where she would be admired. Maria watched them. Her hands felt that coldness again, the kind that travels like a winter through bone. She gripped Isabella's wrist by the roughness of the vein. "You will go?" she asked. "I must," Isabella answered before she realized it. It seemed that the answer had been sewn into her by the dream. The days that followed were a fever of dressings and farewells. Villagers murmured, some with blessing, some with worry. Father Elias, the parish priest, an unassuming man whose spectacles always smudged, pulled Isabella aside. He spoke of vocation and reason, of stewardship and prayer. She thanked him and said she wanted to see if her hands were quick enough for other work. Lucian's world opened like a polished box. Cities smelled of oranges and smoke and other bodies. Isabella learned to talk quickly and laugh when expected. She sat at tables where strangers praised the cleverness of conversation. Men offered her coins like the golden roses in her dream. She wore new clothes and grew used to a mirror that loved the angles of her face. Yet the dream rose thorns had already pricked. The first night she heard an undertone that the music did not cover, a whisper that her smile could be owed and bartered. When admiration arrived as currency, Isabella began to measure people by what they gave her of it. She left prayers unkissed and the rosary cold on a hotel chair. She had thought she wanted the life beyond the bell, now she ran from its voice. Weeks stretched into a year. Isabella's glow was rented but steady. The troupe moved through courts where applause followed the clever like a shadow. Lucian was everywhere that pleased her most. In the chair closest to her at feasts, in the silk that brushed her shoulder, in the promise always waiting. Then, at a masked gala ringing with crystal and the smell of roses, she looked into a hand mirror and saw herself sharpened by servitude to praise. Her hands trembled. The golden rose Lucian had given her as a token lay in her pocket, and her thumb found its edge, not soft like real petals but cold as coin. The reflection stared and peered and looked away. In that mirrored face something unvoiced moved, a memory of Maria's hands and the texture of bread at dawn. The bell of the village tolled in her mind like a tiny bell inside a bell tower. She could not tell whether the sound came from the place she had left or from some deeper room in herself. She left the gala without Lucian noticing. The streets were bright with lanterns and the sky churned with clouds. Isabella walked until the city blurred into a place of sealed doors and anonymous windows. She slept on a bench in a garden that smelled like the sea Lucian had promised but tasted like loneliness. When she woke, a woman sat beside her, a seamstress who mended the poor and had once known Isabella in passing. Her hands were knobby with years but gentle. She offered Isabella bread. "You don't belong to their mirrors," the woman said. "Come and stitch what we stitch. Even skirts can mend a soul." But Isabella could not. She had given too much to the glitter to repair it with some broad needle of humility. She began to move like an animal toward what she had left behind. A week later she returned to the village. Night had fallen with a geography of stars bright enough to shame city candles. The bell tower stood above the houses like an old sentry. Isabella walked up the hill until the church opened its arms in the dark. Father Elias, surprised at the hour, met her at the door holding a lantern. His spectacles fogged as he smiled. "You're home," he said simply. She tried to speak and could not, so she did what she had not done in too long. She knelt. The bells pealed with a sound that was both terrible and tender as confession. She remained until dawn, praying with words that stuck like old threads into a worn fabric. The smell of the sanctuary, wax, wood, incense, seemed to revive a language she had forgotten. Days turned to a rhythm again. Isabella took to walking the fields with Maria's rosary, fingers learning the pace of prayer once more. The village slowly recognized her, not as the woman who had been tested by applause, but as the one who had returned. Some embraced her, others watched like those who study a healed wound with a mixture of awe and caution. But the world Lucian offered did not like being abandoned. For him the admiration of women was a currency. For him, a woman's desire to be seen was a staging ground. He came back to the village one autumn when the orchards were heavy. He returned with songs in his pocket and a carnival wagon beside him. He told the villagers that he had found something new, a fair for those who had left their faith behind and wanted to reclaim fun without dogma. His voice tricked like a river under ice. "Why not?" he asked on the green, smiling at the faces that had once cheered him in other places. "Why deprive yourself of joy?" Isabella watched through the church window. The bells were silent, people were curious. She could see Lucian stop by Maria's door and that tightened the old ache. One evening he sought her out where she mended a child's torn sleeve. "You are luminous when you kneel," he said. "You could be luminous in 1,000 rooms. Come with me, return to the world, Isabella. You are stronger now, you can command it, not be commanded." For the first time, Isabella felt anger like a fire that could protect. "The world you sell leaves women empty," she answered. "You gild vanity and call it grace." Lucian's smile thinned. "And what would you do? Preach? Tie them to old stones?" "I would tell them there is a bell that sounds before and after every noise," she said. "I would tell them there is a bread that feeds more than appetite." He mocked the bread and the bell and gathered a crowd to watch. He put up his lights and his glass and his promises. The carnival swelled like a wave at sea. Vendors came. People came because they were curious and tired and wickedly hopeful that there might be pleasure without cost. The night of the festival a wind like warning wound through the village. Lanterns bobbed like startled fish. Inside her chest Isabella felt a pulling, something like the cords of the bells being tightened. She took the rosary around her neck and walked to the green. When she arrived, Lucian stood on a raised platform beneath a canopy of lights. He waved like a prince. The crowd leaned in, thirsty for novelty. Isabella climbed the steps, heart pounding, and she did not shout or curse. She only began to speak. She told them a story of a woman who had left, who had been dazzled and cheered, who had found herself hollow as a drum. She named the thing that had lured her, not with Lucian's name alone, but with 1,000 small things. The need to be admired, the taste for praise, the habit of measuring worth by applause. Is it wrong to want to be loved? A voice called from the crowd. It is not wrong, Isabella answered. It is human. But when your heart's measure becomes what others will give you, you hand your soul to a market. The bells will not ring for what is bought with applause. They ring for what does not live in the light of an audience. She spoke about the Eucharist and the way bread could make a body's hunger mean something else, a remembrance that refuses to be exchanged. She spoke quietly of the confessional where faces learned their truth unobserved. She did not condemn, she invited. Her voice was not that of a preacher who has power but of one who had lost it and found it again in the shape of service. Lucian laughed, then, a high falsetto that tried to cut. Who are you to talk of hunger? He cried. You who left and returned, your way is dull. Isabella looked at him and, astonishingly to those who had not seen the change since she returned, she was not the frightened girl from the city. She had arms warmed by labor and hands marked by stitches made for other people. I am a woman who was asked to be a thing and chose to be a person, she said. I am no one's ornament. I am my God's. The air seemed to hold itself. Lanterns swayed as if something else breathed. Lucian's grin seemed to strain. Then the bells rang. They rang from the tower above the green like thunder from a friendly sky. They had been silent during the carnival setup, but at the crucial sound they could not be ignored. The villagers froze. In that ringing something unglued itself from the night. Lucian's carnival lights flickered as if a storm had crossed them. Words became less effective beneath those bells. People remembered other mornings, other hands, other sacrifices that had once steadied them. The laughter thinned. Lucian had power in the applause, but the bell's sound had a different economy. It traded memory and called out commitments. Men whose joy came like a season remembered spouses who had waited. Young women who had thought themselves owed recognized instead the quiet power of tending. For the first time Lucian's mask slipped. He stepped down from his platform and walked forward, not with charm but with a plea. Isabella, he said raw now, do you not see? I make people happy. Why do you fight that? I fight that because it is not enough, she answered. Happiness that costs your soul is not happiness at all. We were made for a joy that is deeper, a joy that bears you rather than uses you. There was no miracle in terms of fire or thunder that evening. There was, instead, the ordinary miracle that sometimes occurs when enough people reach a limit and remember who they are. The villagers turned away from the lights and returned to their homes. Some went to the church. The carnival emptied like a tide retreating. Lucian, for all his art, found himself packing alone. Isabella did not celebrate as if she had vanquished something by her own strength. She walked to the bell tower and climbed with Father Elias. He did not praise her like a trophy, but he offered her his arm. Do you think it is finished? He asked. No, she said softly. But I think they heard. Years passed. Isabella grew in the village, not into a monument, but into a river of small acts. She taught girls to read using the Psalms. She sat with men who had lost work and listened instead of offering trite counsel. She became the midwife for 3 generations of children. Once, during a bad winter, she walked across frozen fields with a lantern and a loaf of bread to someone who had no wood left and left the last of her blanket on their bed. She married at 27, not to a prince or a king of some court, but to a carpenter named Tomas whose hands were calloused like plough leather and whose laugh was the sound of a hinge newly oiled. They made their vows before the bell, and when they knelt at the altar, Isabella felt the smallness of the village and the vastness of God taste the same. Lucian never returned. Sometimes the troupe of performers would pass by on distant roads and a child would point and ask whether the man was handsome. A woman would tell the child that a handsome voice is not the same as care. The village had learned to weigh praise by other measures. When Maria died, Isabella held the rosary, knelt, and let the bell carry the old woman's name up like grain. Father Elias, whose hair had silvered into a crown of years, taught Isabella's children the hours with the same smudged spectacles. Isabella lived a life that would not astonish a court, but it baffled the fancy of the city. She did not become famous in the way Lucian's actresses had, but the village thrummed with a faith that was not loud but enduring. People came from other towns to hear the soft way she told stories of mercy. They left with the impression that grace was less about grand feats than a dozen ordinary mercies given without applause. On the day she died, the sky had the color of old vellum. She was surrounded by the family that had grown like vines from the seed of her household, children's children calling her Nana. She did not go in a storm of trumps but in the hush of breath, like someone taking a familiar road. Tomas closed her eyes. The bells rang as if they had been waiting for this exact hour. At her funeral people told the story of the woman who had left and returned, but they told it as a testimony not of shame but of hope, that wandering is often the first step toward a truer home. Father Elias, kneeling to watch the bread lifted during the Mass, said simply, "She learned where the bell spoke." When the villagers gathered afterward at the green, a young woman, perhaps 20, who had been restless and shiny with city stories, said softly, "I thought I wanted to be admired like that. I thought it would prove I mattered." Isabella's daughter, a woman named Lucia who looked like both her mother and the river, took the young one's hand. "You matter already," she said. "But learn to sit where the bell rings. Learn to let your heart keep a place for that sound." And so the tale traveled beyond the valley as one of many small wonders do, moved by the mouths of people who have been steadied by a life lived in fidelity. Pilgrims came sometimes, and girls from the towns across the river would trace the path Isabella had taken and stand where the bell could be heard best to listen. If you come upon that village you will still hear a bell. It will be just a bell among many, but if you listen long enough you might hear another sound beneath it. A woman's laughter, a child's prayer, the rhythm of looms and of hands. You might remember that the world offers roses that glow like lanterns and crowns that bend with weight. And you might, if your heart is honest, learn to measure your days not by the brightness of the lamp beside you but by the depth of the bread you break and the steadiness of the bell you keep within. Once upon a time is not an end. It is the beginning of remembrance. Of a woman who ran hard enough to find out what she had been running from, who returned not to escape but to heal, and who, in the ordinariness of her rescue, became the kind of light that does not blind but stays. Before it is too late, before applause becomes your altar, hear the bell. Keep a place where it can speak. The story is complete when the heart learns the sound it was made to answer.